Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Indira Peterson. You know many things about her. I'll just give you a short synopsis. She's one of the preeminent scholars of Sanskrit and Marathi literature and Hinduism, Indian cultural history, performing arts, a varied number of interests. She's also a polylinguist. She speaks Russian, Greek, Marathi, Kannada, Tamil, Hindi, Sanskrit, and it goes on and on and on. She has a PhD from Harvard University, and she's written many books, including Design and Rhetoric in a Sanskrit Court. She's translated the Kiratha Arjunaya of Bharavi for the Murthy Classical Library series published by Harvard University Press. She's also the author of Poems to Shiva, and with George Mitchell, The Great Temple of Thanjavur, 1,000 Pasts. I might have got that wrong, but Performing Pasts, Reinventing the Arts in Northern South Asia with Ganesh Soneji. She's also been the editor of the Northern Anthology of World Literature for the Indian Literature section. She has a gazillion grants and many things. You can look that up. But she's also very special to me because I'm a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, where she was a professor. And it is actually a little bit of a tragedy that for my 4 years at Mount Holyoke, Professor Peterson was doing far more glamorous things than teaching undergraduates at Mount Holyoke. She was off in Columbia University with a very prestigious position over there. And she did decide, even though Columbia University desperately wanted her to stay on, to come back to Mount Holyoke. But that was unfortunate for me because I had already left. So I came back. So a couple of years ago, I happened to be, but she was a legend on campus in Mount Holyoke, and forever I was cursing myself that I had come in exactly the 4 years that she wasn't teaching there. Well, time had a remedy for this. A couple of years ago, Indira Peterson was giving a lecture at NIAS, the National Institute of Advanced Studies here. And it was, interestingly enough, about court poetry from the Thanjavur court. And this was of interest to me because my own family, some of whom are here today, are from Thanjavur. So I went up to her, introduced myself, and over that time we've become friends. And we've done many things together. We've had some adventures. And I'm very glad that the BIC is letting me get the education that I missed out on having, and by letting me organize some of these talks here and in other places as well. So it's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a privilege to be here, and to hear her also speak about something that is very close to my own heart, because my family is from Thanjavur. And I think for a lot of us, we grow up not knowing our own history or the forces that shaped our own history. I'm really grateful to you for a lot of your research, which has shed so much light and illumination on that. So thank you, and yes.
Where's Rajeshwari? Sitting, yes, over there, is here, and we meet once again after almost 15 years. We met in Bangalore after a long time, and she's done some great work on the religion surrounding the Thanjavur kingdom of Tiruvallur. So it's really an amazing, wonderful audience here. I know others are here too. People who have connections like you and your father, and others who have interest in scholarship, and others who are simply interested in knowing about this material which has been hidden. So I will just launch, and I would like a glass of water because I'll be very dry in just a few minutes. Maybe I should even start with a little bit of water, and I hope everyone can see the images here. I'll just launch into the poem. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. silent upon a peak in Darien. If the mic is doing strange things, please fix it, but that poem is the inspiration for this book on which this talk is based. How many of us have not had that moment, silent upon a peak in Darien, or looking into Chapman's Homer? Chapman's Homer, by the way, was one of the most turgid translations of Homer imaginable. And to think that John Keats, the sublime poet of the English language, thought that that was magnificent. I wish he had lived today to see some of the great translators translating Homer. But that is what our relationship with books. We are here in the library. We want books because they speak to us and we get those experiences. For me, the realms of gold were literally, it began in childhood, as I'm sure it did for many of you. And for us as Indians, especially for my grandfather and grandmother's generation, books were something different. They were from a European culture. For them, manuscripts and oral tradition, other things were far more important. The printed book was a novelty. So my talk is about a person to whom the printed book was a novelty, but who became one of the owner of one of the rarest, the most magnificent European Enlightenment libraries in India, which is still 90% intact and little known, a private library. Now, my introduction was, and I'll just mention this in passing, I remember going down to under the stairs. There was a place under the stairs where all the textbooks that my uncles, my mother, and they had all used during the King George era, because all of the books began with God bless the king, God bless our gracious king, and it is the national anthem, the British anthem. But once you got past that, there were these magnificent things. There was Chaucer, there was Milton, there was the whole of English literature. And one book in particular, which I remember, was The Explorers. It was about Amundsen and Scott, and the polar explorers and the Northwest Passage and things like that. So I would just disappear under the stairs and not come out till lunch or dinner or something would happen. So that was my introduction to certain realms of gold under the stairs. The other one was my maternal grandfather, and here I'm going to be a little boasty, because he was the presidency gold medalist for Madras presidency in 1915, and his library was literally, all the books had gold edges, and the shelves went, for miles. And these were books that he had won. These were books that were given to him, books that he had bought. And so this was where I was brought up, with his library. And then I became an English literature specialist because of all of this. Eventually I turned to Sanskrit again, which I had studied for a long time. So that conversation between Indic learning and the European Enlightenment has been a part of my life, as I'm sure it has been part of every one of our lives as bicultural people. Now, when we think of people and their reading, for some of the best-known intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th centuries, I think of Henry David Thoreau, who was my inspiration. I went to school in Concord, Massachusetts for a year on an American Field Service scholarship, so I was immersed in Thoreau, Alcott, and Emerson. But also Mahatma Gandhi, whom I read very carefully. Both of them record their relationships with books. And this is something which impressed me very much. Thoreau, in his Walden, has an entire chapter called Reading. So reading is something which makes us, and our intellectual profile is something which is shaped by reading. Most Indians in the 19th century were thought of as having had a brainwashed colonial education, which they got at school after the Macaulay dictum that they would study English language and vernacular medium and things like that. But very little has been done to study the effects of picking up a book and relating to it the way Gandhi or Thoreau did. Thoreau, by the way, was profoundly influenced by the Bhagavad Gita as was Gandhi. One was an outsider, the other was an insider. But Gandhi also read Tolstoy and Ruskin, and they were very important to him. And for Thoreau, other people were important too. So my talk concerns that kind of relationship with books. So let me launch into this mysterious person, Serfoji of Tanjore. I have been passing the last 4 days in the society of a Hindu prince, the Raja of Tanjore, who quotes Fourcroy, Lavoisier, Linnaeus, and Buffon fluently. These are 19th century, early 19th century chemists and geologists. Buffon was a multi-purpose scientist, but Lavoisier and Fourcroy and Linnaeus, of course, was the great taxonomist of botany and natural science, natural history. He has formed a more accurate judgment of the poetical merits of Shakespeare than those so felicitously expressed by Lord Byron, and has actually emitted English poetry very superior to Rousseau's epitaph on Shenstone, at the same time that he is much respected by the English officers in his neighborhood as a real judge of a horse. The truth is that he is an extraordinary man. This is an excerpt from a letter from Reginald Haber, the Bishop of the Anglican Church in Calcutta, that he wrote from Trichinopoly, South India, on April 1st, 1826, to his friend Wilmot Horton in England. Haber had just visited the kingdom of Thanjavur as part of a tour of Christian communities in India and Ceylon, and the man who inspired the rapturous description I quoted was King Serfoji, who ruled Tanjore under British colonial supervision from 1798 to his death in 1832. My capstone project at Mount Holyoke, which was a retirement project, grew out of the biography that I had just completed of this fascinating figure in Indian and world history, who navigated with spectacular grace the different worlds of pre-colonial Indian ideals of scholarship and kingship and the European Enlightenment. And he ruled from 1798 to 1832, very early. And that's another reason I chose this, because what do we know about the Enlightenment in relationship to Indians who lived in that early era before there was any Macaulay or any kind of English education? Ruler of a small kingdom at the margins of empire, Serfoji built on his European education, very unusual in his time, to engage with Europe and the European Enlightenment in conversation with Indian knowledge systems and arts, and to disseminate European arts and sciences in Tanjore. His pioneering career owes much to the circumstances of his early life and his accession to the throne. And I'll get to the images in just a minute. Tulajaji II of Thanjavur, who was a Maratha ruler in the Maratha dynasty, which ruled Tanjore from 1675 to 1855, when the Raj was declared extinct by the British. This Tulajaji had adopted the 10-year-old Serfoji on his deathbed as his designated heir. Now, Tulajaji was very much under the British thumb because he had a sort of a subsidiary alliance treaty with the British, as did all his successors. And by Serfoji's time, as you will see, the kingdom was taken away because the British took over. He had adopted Serfoji and named him as his designated heir. But the 10-year-old prince's legitimacy was contested. Another person was given the throne. Serfoji was finally rescued from his imprisonment in Tanjore and mentored by a celebrated Protestant missionary, an educator called Christian Friedrich Schwarz, a German who worked both for the British and the Danes in Tranquebar on the coast near Thanjavur. And the East India Company government gave Serfoji further education with another missionary for 3 years in Madras. But this was a very spotty education because he was tutored by somebody at home. He had the missionary coming to the prison where he was kept and given a few books. So by age 15 or 16 or 17, Serfoji emerges like a butterfly from a cocoon, reading Plutarch, Chaucer, and Dante and things like that. So this was really a prodigy, an individual who had an immense potential. They then restored the 21-year-old Serfoji to the Musnad in 1798, only to reduce his kingdom to just the fort and the city of Thanjavur, and pensioned him off for the rest of his life. But 1799 was also the beginning of an illustrious royal and intellectual career. Let me show a few slides. I think I pressed this, am I right? Yes, there he is in a portrait. I won't comment too much. If I linger on the paintings, then we won't be able to hear the talk. So I'm just going to. This is an early portrait, 1800, the period that I would be focusing on. Everyone knows where Thanjavur is. I don't need to show you. There he is in procession, a company-style painting, a magnificent king, the Saraswati Mahal Library, which I'll mention in just a minute. An illustrious royal and intellectual career, starting in 1799 till his death in 1832. His projects included translation from all kinds of languages and cross-cultural, modern schools, which were rare or impossible in India at the time, modern schools teaching European as well as Indian subjects in 5 languages and Sanskrit, new forms of performance and visual arts, which was the birth of modern Bharatanatyam and the Carnatic music tradition in its modern forms, and the first private Sanskrit and Marathi printing press for publishing textbooks for his school, the earliest Devanagari script printing press in South India, owned by a private individual, or actually anyway. At the center of his enterprise were 2 libraries. The first was Tanjore Saraswati Mahal Library, here in 1995 when I started my work there, and then see its glamorous facade now, 2018 I think. A premier royal library of traditional Indian learning and the arts in Sanskrit and Indic languages, more than Sanskrit, in Tamil, Marathi, Telugu, Prakrit, Kannada, you name it, all the languages are there, and texts on the performing and visual arts as well. So it's a remarkable library, a government treasure, named as a national treasure. All of you should go and visit it. It's a magnificent place. The second library was the king's personal collection, and here comes my subject, of over 4,700 books dating from the 17th to the early 19th centuries. You will all agree that this is a very rare library. This is not, they're European books, and you couldn't find them together in one place, intact, even in European libraries, belonging to one person, unless they were very, very famous, like King George. His library, if you've been to the British Library, the current building in Euston Road, you know that his library, the King's Library, is the center, is the core of the building, and you walk around it and you drink coffee and tea and beer around it, but there's the library. Sarfoji had such a library. A number of journals and periodicals in English and other European languages, as well as these books, covering the entire range of Enlightenment disciplines, 27 rubrics of a catalogue. Everything was covered, all the arts, sciences, and social sciences. Side by side with Tanjavure's great library, built up by Saraswati Mahal, the king's European collection remains intact, and I've already told you this, providing us with a rare example of an early Indian collection of European books. The earliest interactions Sarfoji had with the book, printed book as an object, came obviously through the German missionary who would have given him printed books. And we shall see that these people were, these German missionaries, here is a marble relief in the church in Thanjavur where Schwartz preached, which was actually made by John Flaxman, the most famous neoclassical sculptor in England at the time. His reliefs, memorial and funeral reliefs, are in Westminster and Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Church. Sarfoji commissioned a memorial to Schwartz in Thanjavur, of all places, and his was the first memorial to be ordered. Now, these are the first Tamil grammar in Latin. Not the very first, but the first Protestant version of the Tamil grammar in Latin was printed with this hand press, this kind of hand press imported from Halle in Germany on the coast in Tranquebar. So Sarfoji was very close to print culture through the missionaries and their endeavors. Here is the Tamil Bible. There is the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then here is the Tamil version of it in one of the earliest type fonts set for Tamil by any print culture. Now here are the manuscripts of Saraswati Mahal. I'm going to quickly run through them. Just magnificent. They need constant upkeep. There are great paper manuscripts in Marathi from the Maratha period, as well as hundreds of Telugu and Tamil. And here I am examining Serfoji's books kept in locked almirahs, and I had to sit there and wait for each book to come out of the 4,700. I spent 5 or 6 years calling, a few books at a time over a period of 1 month or 2 months. So I've grown a few gray hairs doing this, but I was very pleased I could look at them. Now, the sources, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. This is the Modi script of Marathi, in which the records of the Marathas are kept. So, these undeciphered, unread bundles probably contain a lot more information about Serfoji and his library than I could ever see. Only 11 out of 900 bundles have been transcribed into Devanagari, and very few people read Modi. Luckily, because Serfoji was under British supervision, there are also the records of his correspondence with Europeans, which were censored and kept in the British records in the British Library, as well as the Tamil Nadu archives, and I did my work there. And the 11 bundles themselves yielded enormous amounts of information about what books he ordered, what books he read, whether in Sanskrit or Tamil, Marathi or English. So these were my sources. Okay. The next interaction with books that he had was, of course, in Madras city. Remember, I said he was there for 3 years. The first circulating library in Madras was founded in 1790. So he would have been exposed to that public library. As a protege of the British government, he moved in the highest circles, including Cornwallis and Wellesley, who were in Madras at the time during the Tipu Wars, the Mysore Wars. The Mysore Wars did not end till 1799, and the British became supreme in the south only then, after killing Tipu Sultan in 1799. During the time Serfoji was there, the 2 sons of Tipu were hostages. They were held hostage in Madras city, and there is a record of a European concert at St. Mary's Church in Madras Fort, where the 2 hostage sons of Tipu Sultan sat side by side with Serfoji of Tanjore, who was a protege. So very interesting stuff going on. But what he then read at that time from his tutor were things like, as I said already, Chaucer, Aesop, Plutarch, but also very basic English books like Sarah Trimmer's book, Learn English in 5 days, that sort of thing, and then The Spectator and various other journals. So he had a fairly wide swath. And Governor Charles Oakley gifted him the entire works of Samuel Johnson, and Johnson's dictionary was his close companion. In fact, he collected multiple copies of that dictionary. Okay, so moving to some of these other things. At my retirement, as I said, Mount Holyoke gave me a grant to work on this project. The outcome will be a book which I want to title Realms of Gold, The Enlightenment Library of King Serfoji of Tanjore. The book will situate Serfoji's European library in the context of histories of the Enlightenment, of course of Indian encounter with it, but also much broader. The Enlightenment did not happen in Europe or in one place. It happened everywhere because these books traveled in ships, in East India men, all over to India, but also all over the world. And let us not forget the first colony, the American colony. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were also consumers of these Enlightenment books, and they spread the Enlightenment in America. Serfoji was in good company, although his name is forgotten, and Jefferson's and Franklin's are immortalized. So I hope that my project will illuminate his path-breaking career as consumer and purveyor of Enlightenment knowledge at the margins of empire in the early 19th century, and in relation to European and local practices in these regards. My questions are these. What was the place of particular works in the intellectual profile of Serfoji's intellectual profile and his relationship with European ideas and their place in shaping the contemporary world? Like every book shaped something. And we have evidence from Serfoji's career. And the second question I ask is, what is the place of particular works in the intellectual profile of contemporary in other Indians, like Ram Mohan Roy, or Ram Ras, or Kavali Venkata Lakshmaya, all of whom were working for British people. They were very closely related, whereas Serfoji was sitting like a spider in his fort, consuming books, interacting with a few military and civil officers, and corresponding with a few others under censorship. What a very different life profile you have for that relationship. That's what I wanted to examine. So there was a catalogue which also helped me. It was executed by Serfoji in 1830, 2 years before his death. So I knew exactly what books he had 2 years before his death. Because after his death in 1989, when a catalogue was made, many books were lost or missing. Others had been added during the successive regimes following him, so we could not make out what his intellectual profile was. But this 1830 catalogue, I stumbled on it, and it's handwritten. So another thing I did was, I wasn't allowed to photograph it or to Xerox it, so I sat there and hand copied it over multiple years. Anyway, so I will trace the library's history of acquisition and circulation, as well as the uses that the king put the knowledge, to which the king put the knowledge embodied by the collection. So I'm interested in collection, acquisition, organization, and the purpose. So these are the four things. In today's presentation, I will briefly share with you the specifics of the issues and questions I have identified as important and useful ones for this biography of the library. But I also want to introduce you to particular books and their place in Serfoji's world and the larger Enlightenment world, and to share with you the excitement of picking up these rare old books, which I was allowed to actually pick up, some with their gold-tooled leather bindings still intact, and exploring their lives and impact then and now on the 19th century king, and on us perhaps in the 21st century, and the great joy of traveling like Keats in realms of gold. So now I'll give you the specifics. Visiting Tanjore in January-February 1804, early in Serfoji's reign, I seem to have gone forward, I want to go back now. So acquisition, collection, and I also want to, is this timed or something? Because it seems to have a mind of its own. So anyway, I wanted to talk about this, I've talked about this, so now I can show you. Why isn't it going backwards? I'm trying.
Backwards is, the top one.
Yeah, I've gone too far ahead. So, I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time doing this. This is... Now is it going forwards? I have no idea what it's doing. I think it's... Oh, I'm sorry. I need to go back. Let's go back to the fifth slide or something. And let's go back as far as we can, and let's stop at a particular place. Even before that, So which is the top? And this is the top. So I misunderstood. This is forward.
No.
This is forward. This is backward. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a pointer. Okay, so that's very good. Thank you. I didn't know that. I just use my laptop and I use the forward and backward arrows, Okay, so here's the drawing room and here's where we're coming. Visiting Tanjore in January 1804, early in Serfoji's reign, George Annesley, Viscount Valentia, noted in his account of his visit to the court, the king's upstairs room was carpeted and had English chairs. A descendant had tried to reproduce that room, and that's what you're looking at here in the 1980s. Tulajendra Raja did this reconstruction. The king's upstairs room was carpeted and had English chairs. Opposite to each were 4 bookcases filled, chiefly with English books, amongst which I was not a little surprised and pleased with discovering my grandfather Lord Lyttelton's History of Henry II in 5 volumes. Now the big joke is that this was considered the most boring tome ever written, and Lyttelton wrote it over a period of 30 years and nobody ever looked at it again. And poor Serfoji had to own this volume. Bishop Haber, whom we heard before, who came 22 years later, 1826, and unfortunately died 2 days after he visited Serfoji and became immortalized, He died suddenly. Completing Haber's account of his visit, his archdeacon, Thomas Robinson, spoke of 10 bookcases with books in European languages, Sanskrit and Marathi manuscripts, and a large technical library. The collection had grown substantially. And now you can see the current collection from the 4,700, which are unfortunately, the gold tool bindings no longer exist. They've been covered over with preservational bindings and so on. So the few rare ones that I saw, this is just some of his books in French in one cabinet. And there are, I haven't counted. I guess this is cabinet number 83. So just imagine where I was. Acquisition, collection, maintenance, and catalogue. The sites of contact and archives from which one could gather information about these books and their travel are Tanjore, London, Copenhagen, Tranquebar, Halle, and Madras. We've already seen that. And I show not only books, but sculptures, scientific instruments, all of which were related to the books because the science books were directly related to instruments and experiments and learning. They were not just there for show. 650 books on medicine for practical medical practice. He studied with a surgeon, W.S. Mitchell, the European British surgeon, for 3 years, surgery, and had a hospital built and had his Indian physicians work with the Europeans and also exchange knowledge. And at the same time, he had 18 volumes of Tamil poetry written, collecting Ayurveda, Siddha Vaidya, and Unani medicine, so that they are called Sharabhendra Vaidya Muraigal, and they are fascinating volumes because he wanted to modernize medicine by synthesizing all allopathy with all of these things. So it wasn't simply V.S. Naipaul's mimic men. He was doing something very creative with enlightenment knowledge. Here are some of the wonderful gold volumes. And here's the catalog, first page. And in a couple of minutes, I'll read what that first page says because it's rather faded. But I won't detain you with this. But here is that great discovery I made at the Tamil Nadu archives when I was almost falling asleep. The first shipping list I found of this ship, the 650 books on medicine. I didn't find the entire list. I found parts of it, and this part has the most important books on early medical 17th and 18th century books, all very rare now and worth millions and millions and millions of pounds and dollars. So these, some of them exist: Van Rader's Hortus Malabaricus, Roxburgh's Plants of the Coromandel Coast, but also major volumes on medicine, 650 books. There's a story which I'll tell you in just a minute. As you know, they had to come by sea, and there were many kinds of hazards to be overcome, and one shipment of 600 books was lost, and they were replaced by these 650 books. Intellectual profile. Okay, so Robinson then, by Robinson's time, as I said, it's grown, and I won't talk about the details of that long description, but here there were 10 bookcases in the place of the 4 that Valencia had seen. Haber now sees 10 bookcases, and by our time it's multiplied into like 100 bookcases, right? In an adjoining room is an air pump, an electrifying machine, an ivory skeleton, astronomical instruments, and several other cases of books. And then he shows various things and his printing press and everything. This is what he's most proud of, this printing press. The changes in the room chart the development over the years of Serfoji's engagement with different forms of Enlightenment learning. Robinson must have recognized that Serfoji's room, with the encyclopedic scope of study and activity indicated by the equipment, was in fact a cabinet for the study of the sciences and arts, an encyclopedia of the sort that was popular among kings and gentlemen and aristocrats in 17th and 18th century Europe, a room that embodied the spirit of one who came to India and became the most illustrious man in the British Enlightenment, connected to India, Sir William Jones, who established the Asiatic Society in Calcutta in, I forget whether it's 1783 or 4. His charge to the Asiatic Society was simply this: the objects of our enquiry, man and nature, whatever is performed by the one or produced by the other. That's an encyclopedia. The catalogue, I won't detain you with, about the details, but as I said, the title was His Highness the Raja Serfoji Maharaja's General Catalogue of an extensive and valuable collection of book and of library. Book is sick. Some scribe forgot to put the S in there. Serfoji wouldn't have made that mistake. The title is actually very typical of late 18th century catalogues of personal collection. Every gentleman in England thought he had an extensive and valuable collection, and so did Serfoji, except in this case it's actually true. Possibly the first of its kind for an Indian library, and I talk about the organization, let's forget about that, and I've already told you that it's every rubric, but let's include architecture, antiquities, law, navigation, geography, politics, oriental publications and works treating of India affairs, natural history, biography, memoirs, you name it. And books in French, German, Danish, Latin, Italian, and Dutch form a separate collection. A total of 700 of those, and 2 Greek books included. Maps, atlases, and bilingual and polyglot dictionaries not included. And in addition, a substantial library of books on European music and painting. The king of Tanjore knew he had a rare collection. He inscribed his name, Serfoji Raja, and a date, not necessarily the date of acquisition, but whatever date he happened to write on each precious volume. This is an impressive collection by any standard. With its nearly 4,700 volumes, it rivaled contemporary private libraries of gentlemen all over Europe and America in breadth, but it surpassed many of them in the depth of its holdings in some fields. I mentioned medicine already. 650 books just in one shipment and many more. That is a rare library indeed. Now, and even some European institutional libraries didn't have it. In 2018, I did research to see what other libraries were there in India and Europe that might compare. And I found, and I'm so sorry I don't have a couple of images of the Calcutta, the National Library. What is the National Library now? But that was the first major library in the British capital, which had holdings. Their European books count in 1843, the Asiatic Society's book count was 2,509, half of what Serfoji had. Then this includes the collection brought over from Fort William College in Calcutta, so it wasn't a very big one. But that is because they were Orientalists. They were interested in Indian languages, not in European books. The National Library hand list of rare books typed is a mixed bag, and again I won't go into that, but it includes every local newspaper. The Calcutta Gazette is counted as a book. So once you do that, the number of books can multiply. This yields only a count of 5,029 rare books, okay? The US Library of Congress was rebuilt in 1815 by purchasing the great polymath, the President Thomas Jefferson's 6,487 books, the largest personal library in colonial America in his time, 1814. So this is post Serfoji's beginning of his collection, and his collection equals that of Thomas Jefferson. As I said, I took some photos, but I forgot to include them in there. But the Jefferson Library was reconstructed because the Library of Congress burnt down twice. His own library was dispersed, and I met the librarian at the Library of Congress who actually had to buy the original books from different auctions so that the library could be reconstructed as recently as 15 years ago, and I went and saw it. And I also saw the rare books at the Calcutta. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the greatest intellectuals of 19th century America, the great philosopher, owned only 1,654. But let's not boast about this. The reason was Serfoji was alone with no access to any books anywhere, so he had to get his own books. There was no circulating library, there was nothing. Second, most of the institutions did not allow Indians to be members. And that was true of the Asiatic Society. 1829 was when they first introduced Indian members. They might have lent out their books to some, but it was the very European cabal. Therefore, Serfoji had to own, in the provinces, he had to own his own books. Emerson had Harvard College, he had Concord Library, he had everything in India. Moving on. In a recent part, and I will skip this, Matthew Adams has talked about European libraries in India. What I learned from them is that No library had the profundity or depth of this library. Other than that of the most eminent people, such as Colin Mackenzie, Arthur Wellesley, and also Wellesley of Calcutta, but his brother Arthur Wellesley, who fought the war with Tipu down south, and certain others like Sir William Jones. And they were the only people who owned any books. It was difficult to own books in colonial India. Claude Martin in Lucknow owned a magnificent library, mostly in French and European languages, but also in English. There were a few people like that. So Serfoji's library was amazing. Now, I don't want to go into the acquisition too much, except to say the most important thing, most important source, the collection grew at a steady pace through what were the means. The means were things like auctions. People would buy books. When people died, they immediately pounced on the books and they took them home. The other place where you could buy them were lotteries. There were lotteries where you could buy them. The third was to ship them from England. A few books were printed in India, but not many. Shipping from England was, as I said, a costly and a very hazardous affair. The Napoleonic Wars were on during Serfoji's major shipments between 1800 and 1809 or 1810, and that's when one ship was sunk by the fleet of French ships, and the perils, the storms at sea, damage while unloading in Madras on the rough port, and then ships lost at sea, ordering, all these things were happening. So, in provincial Tanjore, though, every local and visiting European borrowed books from Serfoji's library. His became the center. The Tanjore political resident William Blackburn, who lived in a tent but had a very nice library, he carried them like Babur. Babur used to carry his library and his carpet from the Silk Road along with him from Herat to Samarkand to India. And the great Islamic libraries, and this is one thing I might mention in passing, the great Islamic head courts, the Sultan's courts, Tipu Sultan had a magnificent library, but these were not printed books. That was the one difference. They were like the Saraswati Mahal. They were books, bound books, but they were not printed books. And print culture was the major difference here. The Tanjore political resident borrowed regularly from Serfoji. He even took them to his summer retreat on the coast. Captain James Michael borrowed Mark Wilkes's History of Mysore, which had just hot off the press. Serfoji had the best history collection in the entire area except in Madras. Arriving on tour in 1811, Sir Thomas Strange, Chief Justice of Madras, his first request was, before he got off the palanquin, could he borrow from King Serfoji the latest volume of Thomas and William Daniel's Views of India, because Serfoji was the only person who owned all of the volumes, and the latest one, hot off the press, was the volume on the views of Ellora, which had recently been excavated. So he also got books from traders from Trichinopoli and everywhere. But the most important source, his most important source, was an agent. He had an agent in England, and he had certain booksellers. This was only the best people could afford to get this kind of service. Benjamin Torren, who had been the first political resident when Serfoji was made king, retired in 1803, and till his death in 1832, he supplied hundreds of books that happened in this way. So Serfoji had a wonderful agent. Serfoji ordered books. He knew what he was doing, and this is what it is. Now, the intellectual profile, very quickly going through. He obviously spent lavishly on books from his liberal pension, liberal for that time. He had the sensibility of both a European aristocrat, a bibliophile, a antiquarian, scientist, a Orientalist. He wanted to do all of these things. He was also a country gentleman. If you all watched Downton Abbey, the only reason I watched that Brit show was to drool at that library and wish I had one like that. Most of their conversations about meaningless things happened in that magnificent library at Highclere Castle belonging to the Carnarvons, So that was what Serfoji's library was like. He spent lavishly. There's bibliophilia. For example, let's take one example. A folio edition of Johnson's dictionary. So I think I have about 10 more minutes, and I will quickly, I'll show you some pictures. Good, very good. I want to give a couple of examples and then show you more examples. The collection included a 1784 folio copy. Folio is the largest. There are also elephant folios which are this big. I've actually held them. That's why I kicked myself that I didn't bring the picture of the folios from Jefferson's library. But you have octavo, demi-octavo, duodecimo. Duodecimo is this tiny, pocket-sized book. So all of these, they cut the paper, and I learned all about bookmaking, printing. I even printed. I learned all about 18th century books. This was really fun. Rare Books School is what I went to. But this folio edition was one that he wanted. He wrote to Blackburn, the resident, and said, do you have a folio edition, and if so, could I have it? Blackburn wrote back and said, I do, but it doesn't differ substantially in content from your quarto and your octavo copies. Nevertheless, and I think that what happened was when Blackburn left and retired in 1823, he gave part of his library to Serfoji. So the folio edition joined these other books. Compare also Serfoji's curation of Indian manuscripts in Sanskrit and all the other languages. Rig Veda, Grammar of Panini and others, books on Dharma Shastra, Ashwa Shastra, horse science, Gaja Shastra, elephant science. The library has like 28 volumes, illustrated volumes on elephants, and as many on horses. And the Sanskrit grammar and Vedic studies, all the 6 branches of Sanskrit learning. Serfoji went to Kashi, Banaras, for 2 years between 1820 and 22. And he collected 6,000 manuscripts from Kashi and put them in this library to cover the entire field. The idea is knowledge isn't encyclopedic unless you've covered it. And that was the principle that he applied equally. But there was the enchantment with the Enlightenment, which I think is so important in Serfoji's life, with European history and culture and knowledge systems, and the promise of the mastery of knowledge and the promise of becoming modern on his own terms. Not through education by somebody else, but self-revising, self-educating. That is the principle of the Enlightenment, the Republic of Letters. And this under colonial rule and under surveillance and censorship, the freedom of the mind, as Tagore said, where the mind is free. He set his mind free with this. And the shift from the older ideal which Europeans themselves had of an encyclopedic knowledge was meant the circle of the sciences, which was very defined. But what was happening in the early 19th century? Whole new sciences were bursting into the air, like chemistry didn't exist. Lavoisier and Foucault invented chemistry. Buffon invented natural history. So Serfoji was directly learning about this without any intermediary. And you know who else was learning? It was Jefferson was learning, so was Jones. They talk about how they didn't know anything about chemistry, and I have a photo of Jefferson's collection of the same books that Serfoji had. Okay, so moving on. So this was the Baconian ideal of self-revising knowledge and reason, the direct knowledge. And the next thing is useful knowledge, which was a remarkable offshoot. Catalogues were not common in Sanskrit libraries, and Serfoji immediately on becoming king made an alphabetical catalogue for the entire Sanskrit library and the Telugu library. So here are some manuscripts. I want to move on. Gaja Shastra. I want to move very quickly. Here's the Cyclopedia. The Cyclopedia of Ephraim Chambers was considered to be the model for the French Encyclopédie, which Voltaire, Diderot, and D'Alembert put together and became the model for the entire Enlightenment. Serfoji had multiple copies of both Chambers, who was the old model, and the new encyclopedia in French as well as in English. So he was reading from, directly from all these volumes. There are many other wonderful encyclopedic books there, but I can't go into them. Periodicals, you name any British periodical, European periodical, he had them. What's interesting is he was interested in disseminating this knowledge, and that's what I want to get to. Just look at some of the holdings. The Earl of Chesterfield's letter to his son. This was the most popular book throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in all of England. So Serfoji owns a copy. The spelling book, of course. He wanted his son Shivaji to be educated in English. He also had schools for English, so he had these elementary spelling books, and others included in his library. And most interestingly, there were a bunch of women authors, Sarah Trimmer, Letitia Barbeau, Mariah Edgeworth, who wrote little readers and books for children. He included all of them in his library because he wanted that for his son as well as the other students in the palace. So moving on, essays on the picturesque, so that new visual regime, Serfoji experimented with painting, sculpture, everything, company painting, all kinds of things. And here's this Marathi Aesop, which has a Shri in the place. It's exactly like an Aesop woodcut of the 1790 period, except it has a very Indian kind of look. And it's the first first Indian language or Asian language translation of Aesop, complete Aesop fables ever. And this is the fable of the wolf and the lamb. 1809, one of the earliest. European music, he himself composed music. He had a marching band. And he got every book on every European instrument that you could get, including the clarinet, the trumpet, and everything. His fusion musicians played the violin and the veena, and they also played the entire oratorio Samson in instruments, which is, Handel, and they played the Messiah oratorio. And then he also had light music, the Oriental Miscellany, the airs of Hindustan, which were compiled by Europeans in India, but also the most popular comic opera in which all the popular tunes were there from his time, which every Englishman would have had at that time. This is from the Oriental Missionary. They were copying Indian tunes. This was a rekhta, according to them, but it's written in European notation. Now, I want to quickly, the last section. History and geography and science were his great passions. So Pliny, Cicero, Jefferson had all these. Plutarch's Lives, he was taught this by the missionary. Plutarch's Lives was the model for all kings. So he studied the Plutarch volume. And then oddities like John Blair's Cosmology and History of the World, which starts with the Bible, completely going against the Enlightenment and his discoveries. Now here you have Gibbon's Roman Empire. We think that Serfoji wrote marginal comments on them. We are not absolutely sure, but Gibbon was the most popular historian in England and Europe at the time. And here is Tipu Sultan's catalogue, the catalogue of Tipu Sultan's library. It found its way into Serfoji's library. At the Bradishwara temple, where the Chora king Rajaraja had this magnificent inscription in 1010 AD, Serfoji put his own inscription, a historical inscription, the Bhosala Vamsha Charitra, which details his connection to Shivaji and the Bhosle dynasty and the Marathas in Thanjavur. The only book that tells the history of the Thanjavur Marathas is on the wall. So he was doing both European-style positivist history and Marathi-style Bakhars, which told history in a slightly different way, and also mythology. William Jones, he had the entire Asiatic researches, all 15 or 17 volumes in Elephant Folio, which are the most important chronicles of Oriental studies in India from 1783 to the middle of the 19th century. William Jones's works were all there in multiple copies. The prosody of Telugu and Sanskrit languages of C.P. Brown from 1829, and Enchantment of the Imagination, all of the Daniel volumes, the Shashwamedh Ghat in Banaras, where he actually went and saw. Years after he had Daniel, he escaped from Thanjavur and went outside of Thanjavur. This must have been a magnificent moment. And oddities and exotica like Chinese punishment. Every king and aristocrat in the world had this large pictorial volume. Why? We do not know what it was. And then he created these paintings of his own realm in this hybrid Tanjore company style. If you come to Dalrymple's talk, you know that he specializes in this. This is the last section on cosmology's geography. As I said, geography, being sitting in Tanjore, reading Alexander von Humboldt and other people's volumes, geography and astronomy, European astronomy were passions. We know Jai Singh had his observatories and was also interested in observational astronomy, which was not common in India. Serfoji had globes and other instruments from Halle. This is his electrical machine. He was experimenting with everything. they are the most wonderful star charts, the Atlas Celestis from Nuremberg, published by the Hohmann brothers, the Doppelmayr, and this is only there in a few rare libraries in the world. And here are all the geographies. This collection is complete. Every geography book that was written in that period is in the Serfoji library. Sketch of Geography, Hermann Moll's Atlas Geographus, The World, William Guthrie's System of Modern Geography, and most important, Alexander von Humboldt's Personal Narrative of Travels in the Equinoctial Regions. English translation, 1818, Serfoji autograph. And here I am holding the copy in my hand in 2009. And there is Chimborazo by Aimé Bonpland, who did the plans for this book, in that book. And Emily Dickinson, my local poet, wrote a poem about that. Love, thou art high, I cannot climb thee, but were it two, who know but we, taking turns at the Chimborazo, Dougal at last stand up by thee. And Frederick Church, the most famous Hudson School painter, painted Chimborazo. Serfoji had worldwide kinswomen and men. Serfoji then wrote a Kuravanji drama in which, in Marathi, Indrani, the Queen of Heaven, asks the fortune teller Kuravanji, kindly tell me about the mountains, rivers and countries, about the spherical earth. Tell me, does the earth revolve around the sun or does the sun revolve around the earth? Tell me, O beauty, what is the moon's orbit and what planets revolve around the sun? What is the diameter of the earth's sphere? She asks in Marathi. What follows is both an astronomy and a terrestrial geography which mentions places like Pensacola, Florida, the Caribbean and St. James's Island, Amboina. The entire Pinkerton's geography is done in Carnatic music, and this lady is dancing and singing and telling the students to memorize these things. Botany was his great passion. So here's, it'll come in just a minute. This is Serfoji's, the hibiscus. His painters painted that. This is, on the left was William Roxburgh's Plants of the Coast of Coromandel, the printed book. This is Roxburgh. Here's Serfoji, Saraswati Mahal Library, German book on butterflies, supplemental volumes of Jones's writings, Jones's On the Pangolin, a scientific essay in Asiatic researches, Serfoji's own natural history on the left, the tiger. This is Serfoji, and then he comments on each of the animals and birds, and he sends it to his agent Torin in 1807, and it is in the British Library. And here is the Gaja Shastra volume of Saraswati Mahal, which he also got illustrated. Here is Serfoji's Cassowary. Here is German books which he brought from a German missionary. This is the first description of Indian fish from the South Indian, second description, of the Indian fish from the South Indian coast, from Tracobar and further south. And the mussels and other kinds of mollusks and other kinds of things. This is Systemotics Concilium Cabinet of H. Martini, from the Tracobar missionary C.S. Yorn. Oran's Scopus Lebecki, named by this scientist, which is in Serfoji's possession. Serfoji's handwritten notes on the bird Shama in his natural history album, and the Gaja Shastra and the Ashva Shastra. Buffon's natural history, which he loved above all. And the very last thing I want to say is the Tamil Compendium of Medicine. King Saravendra, who aids the poor, has sung as a Tamil song the good method of the Bhava Prakasha, an Ayurvedic Sanskrit text, after testing the recipe to make sure that the knowledge is efficacious. What is important is not to read. The Enlightenment principle is that you have to observe, then you have to practice. Bacon said everything has to have ultimately a practical effect. And Serfoji, of course, believed in that. And so did the Siddha Vaidyas, and so did all of them. So there was a kind of convergence of opinions. And then a European anatomy in a Marathi translation, ophthalmology case sheet from his Dhanvantari Mahal. And this is the last thing, and I won't read this. This is a recipe. He was elected to the Royal Asiatic Society in London as an honorary member in 1824. He was only one of 4 honorary members, His Serene Highness the Duke of Orleans, His Majesty the King of Oudh, His Royal Highness Abbas Mirza Prince Royal of Persia, and His Highness the Raja of Tanjore. His learning finally paid off. He became one of the select, the elect, the member of the Republic of Letters in England in the Royal Asiatic Society. And he subscribed by paying 10 guineas or 20 guineas. The Travels of Ibn Battuta, the first translation project taken up by the Asiatic Society, the Royal Asiatic Society, in the first printed book of theirs, Serfoji had his hand in that. And the other big copy was King George IV. Thank you. I end my talk here.